This is part 20 of She Prayed Over My Mama. Now, on one of these occasions, after I had went out trying to get the paperwork for guardianship and conservatorship, I did come back into the room, and there were two ladies that were hovered over my mother. And there was another lady off to the side as well, kind of at the end of the bed. And when I walked in, I recognized the pastor's wife. And, she's a very lovely lady. She came, she greeted me with a hug. And I immediately asked, I said, "Who are those ladies?" And she said, "Oh, that's the evangelist Kim and Jackie." And so I said, "Oh, I'm not comfortable with them being here. I am not comfortable with them being here." She's like, "Oh, I didn't know. I'm sorry." She said, "We got to leave." She told them, "We got to leave." I said, "I'm okay with you being here. I'm just not comfortable with them being here." Because mind you, at the time, I had learned already about the transfer into the evangelist Kim's personal bank account. And so at that time, they did leave. Now, this was after the fact that I initially asked her, to come see my mother. And as you recall, in her text message, she said she was busy. But when it was time to come with the first lady, the pastor's wife, and her sister, and it was about the appearance, I believe, she showed up. And I just want to reiterate that we did inform the pastor of her church about what happened. We informed her while my mother was still in the hospital. It was mid-April once we discovered this. And when we first brought this to him, he was very sympathetic to us. He was saying, he seemed, stunned or taken aback by this. He stated, what's right is right, what's wrong is wrong. I don't care who it is, because we had told him, that this transfer had taken place. And at that time, we did not know the depth of the involvement of the evangelist. We took comfort in that he seemed to understand, how devastating this was to have learned, and believe that, that he may take action or discussion about this, since it did occur in the church. And again, at this point, all we knew was about the transfer. We did not know about the additional $17,000 in insurance funds. A few days later, we attempted to discuss this again, bring this transfer up again to the pastor, and we noticed that his attitude seemed to change. We brought up the transfer and the work that had not been completed on the home. And, he was like, "Well, I don't know." He seemed to kind of rebuff that. He was saying, that he knew the hearts and intentions of his sisters, because I had brought up, the transfer and the fact that, some of this money was supposedly going to his sister Jackie, who was alleged to be an interior designer. And again, none of this sat well with me. But at the time, the pastor just seemed to want to separate himself from that and saying, you got to look at two sides to everything. And at this point, we all, meaning my siblings and I, seemed to notice the shift that was happening. I struggled. I really struggled with the fact of having him and the church being involved in any respect in my mother's funeral, based on the financial abuse that occurred to my mom, the financial exploitation that occurred to my mom. I didn't feel like my mom deserved it. And it took a lot of soul searching and the love I had for my mother, because I knew how my mother felt about her church and her pastor. I knew that she would have wanted her pastor to officiate her funeral or do her eulogy. And so I had to put myself and my feelings aside for the betterment of what I believed would have been my mother's wishes. At the time of my mother's funeral, we had learned about the additional $17,000 that the Holy construction crew had gotten from the proceeds of my mother's home insurance policy. And again, that was the Reverend Lowe. That was the church member Stephen from his construction company. I also understand that, of course, the evangelist and then the deacon Walter had all shared in the proceeds. And what I understand also is that Jackie may have gotten some of the proceeds as well. So at the time of the funeral, the evangelist actually, I learned later, showed up. And because I had the inkling that appearances meant more than my mother, given their actions, I informed the funeral director that I did not want to see her there. And because I needed to protect my peace, because I knowing that they took so much from my mom and leaving her home in such a state. My mom didn't deserve that. And I knew I needed to get through that day, and I needed my peace protected. And I thank the Lord for that funeral director who protected my peace. For those that don't know, my mother attended a Church of God in Christ church, and she had been a member of this church for, I believe, a little over 6 years. The pastor also officiated my father's funeral. As I stated earlier, my parents died within 9 months of each other. He's known about the actions of the evangelist and the deacon since mid-April. He made it clear that he didn't want to be involved, even though it happened in the church and involved the church leadership. To me, that spoke volumes, and it still does, because not only was he my mother's pastor, he was also the superintendent in the Kojic church for his designated area. I don't know to this date if he's yet informed the congregation, which I know includes, other elderly women and men in the congregation. I don't know if the financial exploitation and financial abuse that occurred to my mother, if the silence meant that she was undeserving of it being reported. I don't know if the superintendent and pastor actually reported this to the Minnesota jurisdiction. I don't know if he reported it to the national organization, because my understanding is that evangelists are certified or licensed from the Kojic church. Again, I'm not Kojic, but that's my understanding. But I will say that the silence is deafening. It seems to give that appearances or image was more valuable and more deserving of protection or dignity than my mother. It even came across during the eulogy. There seems to be, this undercurrent of preserving the image of the church versus correcting the exploitation of its most vulnerable members. At some point begs the question is, when is your silence complicity in the financial abuse?